This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, I explore the intersection of faith, food, and sensory experience with guest Jeannine Hanger, an associate professor of New Testament at Talbot School of Theology. Jeannine discusses her latest book, Engaging Jesus with Our Senses, which examines the sensory metaphors in the Gospels and their implications for spiritual practice. The conversation covers the role of taste and how using our senses can deepen our engagement with Scripture and our relationship with Jesus. We also touch on the importance of moving away from purely cognitive approaches to faith, the historical and cultural context of sensory experiences, and practical ways to integrate sensory awareness into communal worship. The episode concludes with personal reflections on favorite foods and the sensory dimensions of faith. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I'm your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm joined by Jeannine Hanger. Jeannine is an associate professor of New Testament at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. Her research interests focus on the Gospels, more specifically, participation with Christ. Her newest book, Engaging Jesus with Our Senses, An Embodied Approach to the Gospels, published by Baker Academic, is the latest articulation of this. Outside of teaching at Biola, Jeannine has been married for 26 years to her husband, Garrick, a pastor at Coastline Covenant Church in Redondo Beach. Together, they have 3 kids, ages 21, 19, and 17. So thanks for joining me today, Jeannine. It's great to have a fellow Biola alumni, and now you're a prof there. So yeah, it's great.
Thanks for having me. It's great to connect with a fellow alum.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And was intrigued when I saw, I think, your book being, advertised. I think your colleague Carmen was, publicizing it on Facebook, and was really intrigued by it just because of this idea of how do we engage Jesus in these Gospels with our senses and as embodied people. And so excited to have a conversation specifically around our sense of taste, just because of the notion of the biggest table. So what's the story behind the book? What led you to take on this project, or how did you become involved in this idea?
Yeah, so it actually probably extends back to searching for a topic for my doctoral studies. And if I'm being honest, it goes all the way back to that. Knew I wanted to pursue doctoral studies, was interested in the Gospels. I was also interested in this idea of union or participation with Christ. I think just personally was interested in this idea of there's all these scriptures that talk about being united with Christ, but what does that mean really? And especially, we live in this world where there's very much seems absent, even though we talk about a presence. It's a presence and absence that John talked about. And so I started looking for a topic in Paul's writings, and then it kind of pushed me over to the Gospel of John, just through some reading. And I connected with my doctoral supervisor, and he was the one who suggested, Grant McCaskill, he was the one who suggested checking out the I am sayings, the 7, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world. There are 7 of those that John talks about. And as I spent time reflecting and studying and exploring them, it stood out to me that they were very sensory metaphors. They were very animated metaphors that involve the senses. So tasting, eating the bread of life, and seeing and staying near the light of the world, and hearing the voice of the shepherd. And so I thought, well, I wonder if there's something there. So just to kind of explore that, and that's really what led me to just thinking about embodiment and thinking about the senses. And so this book came out as kind of an extension of that study of just how could we apply this to the Gospels more broadly, and also how can we use this in our Bible reading, not just as an academic exercise, but something that actually, helps us to understand the text better, or actually inspires us to want to engage the text more even. So.
Right. Yeah. Because the idea isn't, it's to get away from just a purely cognitive approach.
Yes.
But to really know Jesus. And so how have we even gotten to a point in society where our senses have been divorced, from our spiritual lives in some respects? Because if I'm honest, being raised conservative, Christian, evangelical, we were sometimes weary of our senses. Even the word sensual, that's a taboo word, it seems. And so where did we go awry where we needed to be reminded of our senses as we engage the Gospels and engage with Jesus?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look at, it goes back, you think about the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment world where it's this Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And we started, I think, around that time to start to separate mind from body, head and heart, and even in a hierarchy, so that you're right, we started to focus more on the mind and kind of those cranial categories of approaching the world. I think it also actually, as it connects to the senses, we tended to prioritize sight over the other types of senses because we live in a very sight-centric world. And so even, the inventing of the printing press, as it pertains to the scriptures, you engage with scripture once that happened, and, you engage the text with your eyes and you think about it in your mind. And so we started to, in some ways, divorce and even, make inferior the sense of smell and the sense of taste, and it doesn't really figure into our Bible reading, right? Mm-hmm. And yet we are all embodied sensory beings who come to texts with our full bodies and our hearts and our emotions, and so I think part of what my project is doing is just calling out that we are embodied beings and not trying to divorce that from our reading. Instead of saying I am trying to be very objective here, and you leave all that out. We're kidding ourselves if we're actually leaving it out, because everyone comes into our reading embodied. And so what does it look like to be open about it? I am an embodied person with a history and memories and things that inform how I read it. And it doesn't really mean, I'm not saying that it takes the text in a direction that could be anywhere, and I think that's sometimes why the church is uncomfortable with this, because we're worried that, if I talk a lot about imagination in my approach to the text, and we get a little nervous about imagination because we're talking about truth claims in scripture, and how can you talk about imagination? So I think we've just kind of somehow divorced these from each other, and they really are meant, our minds are embodied. So
No, because the stories we tell, and as we, engage with things, we recall memories, and you bring that up, and that, even with talking about the bread of life, smell, taste is so associated with all the senses, you feel it, you smell it, you can hear it, you can, you think about, you see it, and then you take, for me, when we eat something, we're engaging all of our senses. But, when we think about food, we have vast memories, and so when you say bread, my mom was a homemaker. She baked bread every week. So I have this vivid recollection of the fresh smell of bread, and so how do those memories, and they could be bad, not always good memories. They can be, painful memories. How does that play then into how we engage the text?
Yeah, that's a great observation, and I do spend some time thinking about that. Because you're right, I can relate to your connection with your memory of bread and your mom. I grew up I'm a baker's daughter, so I grew up with really strong feelings about really fresh bread, and so part of what I'm suggesting is a reading of the text that it's like using your knowledge about taste and bringing it alongside of your reading of the text. And so when you get to a text like Jesus feeding the multitudes bread and fish, and then later on saying, I am the bread of life, it's acknowledging that the ancient readers who would first read these words, they are populating in their minds what they think of when they hear bread, or when they hear, I am the manna that came down from heaven. A lot of them, if they're Jewish and they know the Hebrew scriptures, they are aware of this context, and it has to do with, the manna from heaven tradition, and God raining down manna from heaven day by day, and not only, it's not like they're remembering that happening, because they weren't, they're not having a memory of that, but that might be attached to them, to the ways that they celebrate and commemorate that in their traditions. And so for them, there's certain memories that come alongside of the words bread of life, manna from heaven. And so Jesus's words, when he comes in and says, I am the bread of life, in a lot of ways it's disruptive for them, because they're thinking, well, this is what I think when I hear manna from heaven. And now you're saying that you're manna from heaven. It's a really big statement. And right. So and I think sometimes, we can think about how that's a big statement, but I think sometimes we, like you said, bread is a very multisensory, food is a multisensory experience. If any of us have ever felt what it feels like to be hungry, in your gut what it feels like to be hungry for bread, and think about Jesus saying, I'm the bread of life who sustains you. There's a deeper kind of knowledge that we can bring into our understanding of the text when we think about spiritual hunger, being spiritually satisfied, and how that connects with our physical feelings of those, hunger and thirst and all that.
Right. And so then what role then does taste play in the Gospels, from, feasting to food and imageries? Like there's a lot, there, but for a brief summary for our listeners who may not be, familiar with the imagery, like where does food and table and taste play into Jesus's life?
Yeah, so we see it. We see it anytime he sits down to have a meal, and he does it a lot with people, and with the least of these, really. You see him sitting down to feasts with people that the religious leaders of his day are kind of criticizing him about, like, how can you be eating with, sinners, and right. anyone in their society who is looked down upon. And Jesus is sitting side by side with them, and he's breaking bread with them. And I think in the middle of that, I think part of what I'm trying to do is to just add more descriptive level understanding of the context, is to invite people to put yourself in that context and think about, if you've ever had a really good tasting meal with all the smells and the tastes, but not just the taste, it's the people you're with and the people you share it with and the conversation and all of that. I think that's the kind of table that Jesus sits at with his disciples, and so you see that throughout the Gospels, right?
Right.
So, yeah, that's just one example. Yeah. There are more. So.
No, and he's, one of my favorite verses, I think it's like Luke 7:34, where it says, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you call him a glutton and a drunkard. And so, food and this taste idea plays a central aspect. And you point out in the chapter, this messianic feast idea that, this table is expansive and always, reaching out, and how does then that, like, as we imagine sitting at that table, like what can we do, to move that from, maybe a cognitive exercise to a more felt sensory exercise?
Yeah, I think it gives us some creative opportunities to think about that. And I actually, at the end of each chapter, the book is arranged according to 5 different physical senses. And so the one on taste, I've provided 3 like sensory exercises surrounding taste and eating that people can do to kind of engage with taste as they think about spiritual hunger and nourishment. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to, at the basic level, it's just taste and see that the Lord is good. It is appreciating with gratitude. You're a chef, as I understand, right? So, you probably have a great appreciation for the goodness of good food and all the different tastes that God has created. And what does it look like not only to appreciate that on an individual level, but to share that around the table and all of the things that come with a good meal, and how sitting at the table with people breaks down barriers a lot of the time and creates friendship and creates unity in some ways that other ways of engagement don't. Like our distanced way of interacting with people on social media, for example, is a very divisive means of interacting. But when you sit at a table with someone and you're sharing food, I think there's something different that gets motivated.
No, for sure. And that intimacy, that breaking down, the seeing of each other. I always come back to Henry Nouwen's idea of hospitality from Reaching Out, where it's this idea of hospitality allows the other to become who they were meant to be. And, taste is a very intimate sense. What we eat becomes literally part of us, and it becomes absorbed into us, which I think is very deeply spiritual. And so because you talk that, your big project is this abiding in Christ. And so how does taste move us towards abiding?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. The first thought that I have is, just as I've compared the different senses, it's been interesting to notice that there's different levels of intimacy. And you're right, taste is the one that's probably the most intimate, because you take it inside of you and it becomes part of you. I think another one that's very similar is touch, right? So touch is something, it's, when I use the example of like a kitten's fur, like you could talk about a kitten's fur, you can tell someone all about it, you can show them, but it's not until you actually pet the kitten that you know exactly what it feels like, right? So touch is a certain kind of knowledge, and it's a certain kind of close up, proximate knowledge that you can only get through touch. Whereas we live in a society where with sight and hearing as probably the most dominant ways that we interact in the world, and those are the most distanced, right? Like you and I are conversing through sight and hearing in different states, so there's a lot you can say that's really, personal to someone, but then there's other ways to communicate that makes it a lot more close up. So when you go back to this conversation about abiding in Christ, I think I just kind of explored every time Jesus said, I am the bread, and we're, in the metaphor, to believe is to eat. Right. And so it's a very intimate connection with Jesus, right? So to listen for the shepherd's voice is to stay near, but it's not quite as close as eating. No. And when you get to the abiding metaphor, that one's an interesting one, because you're talking about a branch being fused to a vine. It's almost like garden imagery. And so there actually is nutrients being shared between the branch and the vine in a way that is pretty close up. It's like you're fused together and there's nutrients being shared. So not necessarily taste, but it's kind of a nourishment that is that when you think about union, that's as close as it gets. Right.
And taking in this union and this Christ as we eat, I think our temptation then, if we swing the pendulum too far, is, it's to eat and to become gluttonous. Yeah. But, if we're reminded of the manna, like God gave the Israelites just enough manna for the day, like we're to pray for our daily bread, not more, not less, but so each one had enough. Yeah. And so how do we balance that? Like, cause we all want more Jesus, but I think then we can become almost too gluttonous, to use the appetite metaphor. And so is there a line then when, as we think about Jesus and taste like that, because we've eaten great meals in which we've come away too full.
Yeah.
And so is there a correlation then as you've engaged with that, like with gluttony?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have not thought about gluttony in the way that you're saying, but I guess the way that I've thought about it is when you think about our eating and drinking lives, I liken it to like, all of us have been to an all-you-can-eat buffet,
right?
And you like gorge yourself, and then you come away and you're like, I am never eating again, right?
Yeah.
And but then what happens is the next day you're hungry again.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I think about this like union with Christ, our salvific life with Christ, I think I've likened it to our eating and drinking life. Like we need him every day, like the manna from heaven. And so I don't know if I've thought about it in terms of like how much is too much, but just that we need it regularly. Like we need a regular diet of whatever that nourishment looks like for each person, whether you want to talk about it in terms of, rhythms that you establish in your life, or, what does that look like to be nourished every day, in this life with Jesus.
Yeah. Because that nourishment should propel us outward. I think part of the gluttony is it's all self-serving versus, this idea of, being fed and nourished by Jesus should propel us and outward towards others. And as we think, because the table in the Gospels is presented in a very beautiful way, the messianic banquet, it's this ideal that we don't quite see yet. We get tastes of it. And so how, especially as Western Christians, white, evangelical Christians, I've never known what it is to be without food.
Yeah.
So how does taste and, this idea of Jesus as bread of life then propel us towards the brokenness and the broken stories of food and broken tables that we see in the world?
Boy, that's a great question. I think you're right. Like, I think we live in such a well-satiated context, that it's hard to know what hunger feels like. I think it's helpful to get to know hunger a little bit. In fact, that was kind of how I ended up writing that chapter. Was I happened to be doing a fast, and I talk about it in the book. I talk about how it led me to such a feeling of not just hunger, but like a feeling of lack, and it stripped me of all sense of internal resource. Like I just kind of lost all sense of internal fortitude. Like if someone says something mean to me, I might cry because I'm so hungry and I felt so weak. If someone attacks me, even with words, or says something negative, I remember having that embodied experience of feeling like very vulnerable. And I think that our hunger puts us in touch with our vulnerability. And I just wonder if that would be an important way to connect with populations and people in our lives, and either in our context or other contexts where there's a vulnerability, whether physically, spiritually, any kind of vulnerability.
Right.
When we can be in touch with vulnerability, how might that give us the resource to have compassion for those who are vulnerable as well.
No, for sure. Yeah. I love that idea of the fast being a means of not just, because we think of it as a personal spiritual exercise between me and Jesus, but, how do we use the fast as a means of engagement with the world? I think this could be super powerful. Because again, it like you said, the senses are very individual, but they're also communal in nature. That, we're not, I can taste alone, but I'd never eat alone because the food was produced by somebody else. Like we're all interconnected, and and so how do we balance then the individual and the communal, and how do we bring in the communal as we engage a text, in a very individualized Western society?
Yeah. Are you asking me that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, how do we balance the individual and the communal with our senses?
Yeah. I mean, I think, actually, it's interesting. I'm kind of working on what is next. And I think that's actually my next question is how does this expand out? I'm going to talk about it a little bit, especially near the end of the book.
Right.
Talk about some communal, like, the senses do play into our communal lives when you think about, like, how the senses operate in our corporate world.
Mm-hmm.
Even you think about, like, the smells of incense in worship contexts, that
Right.
kind of sets the context for worship, and sounds of certain songs kind of set the context for, entering into a space of the sacred together in a corporate way. And so, sorry, I've totally lost my train of thought. The question again.
Yeah, no, just I think, bringing this into the communal life. And, I'd be curious,
Yeah.
Your husband's a pastor. And so how does that,
Yeah.
how have you two
Yeah.
start to like wrestle through, it'd be fun to listen to you both talk, hear you guys both talk about how does this practically play out?
Yeah. Yeah. I think what it does is it reminds us, I think that there is a lot more that we can communicate in multisensory ways that actually connects to people more. So when you're talking about even worship spaces, like anytime there's a chance to get up and move or to do something with your, different senses, like tactile, like, like using, rocks when, you've been in places like, here, take this rock. And this is a memorial stone of something, like,
right.
Every semester when I teach the Gospel of John, when we get to John 6 and we're talking about taste, I always bring a big table full of bread. And everyone takes some bread and we talk about bread and they have an experience of eating bread while we're talking about nourishment. And the week that we cover Mary anointing Jesus's feet with perfume, I bring in like a really strong lemon oil and I offer to paint it on everyone's hand. And it just gives them like I remember that smell, and that's going to remind me, like, because the senses connect to our memories. I think there's some interesting experiments we can do with creating memorable opportunities to connect with God and connect with each other in ways that just words on a slide. Take some notes, students. It just doesn't get across.
No.
So yeah, I think it just taps into kind of the goodness of this fully embodied multisensory life that we have.
Yeah. Now, as you were talking about, John 6 and with your class, I'm curious what it looks like, because I have this image of like using different types of bread, from like store-bought Wonder Bread, which has no flavor, to a beautiful artisan, home-cooked fresh bread with sourdough starter that has this depth and rich, and comparing the two and what does Jesus might mean, and like, my imagination started going multiple places, just because I think you could, because we associate bread with maybe Wonder Bread, which is not bread.
Right.
Versus, what is a true loaf of bread, and that crackle and that smell, like, I think there's, to compare and contrast, and what does our society want versus, what is Jesus actually offering, and the difference. So no, like, as listeners, I encourage you, if you're thinking about bread of life, do a taste test of different breads, just to compare and see, and learn about commercial breads that, and I had Kendall Vanderslice, who's a baker, and has a new book coming out about baking and praying, and using. So yeah, there's different ways to engage in this that I think more people are engaging with, and so listeners, just encourage you to think through that bread of life, and to take Jeannine's table metaphor and use it in your own life or with a small group as well. And so then, but then we do think about our communal spot. And I think one of my big soapboxes has been our celebration of the Lord's table. Because if Jesus is the bread of life, like, many times that bread is relegated to an afterthought, or, if we can squeeze it in, and so like, how does the sense of taste then, how can it expand our celebration of the Lord's table?
That's a great question. I would love to experiment with that more in the church setting. I think, like, I grew up with a very, like, like it felt like an add-on at the end of the service with a tiny little cracker, and there's not much taste to it. And in fact, the first time I presented this in one of my student symposium, one of the professors was like, I don't understand how that's going to be a good project at all, because manna from heaven, I don't think, manna tasted that good. Like she was kind of like thinking through all of the, I don't know, when you think about different types of bread and the kind of, the bread celebrated in Passover, was that really tasty bread? How is that, I wish that we made more of a big deal about the Lord's Supper. Like, I think it'd be so cool to, do an entire meal and it's a celebratory, like more than just kind of a moment. Now, so there are some like traditions where, the Lord's Supper is celebrated every week and the service is somewhat revolves around that. I don't happen to be in a tradition where we do that, but we have experimented. We're kind of a newer church. We have experimented with adding a little bit more liturgy. And so it actually does take on a little bit more of a communal, like we're all saying the same words as we're confessing sin and as we're thinking about. That's what I have actually really loved, is kind of this corporate, call and response as we get ready to take communion, which is not like I did most of my growing up years were in kind of the, individual, like just take it when you're ready kind of thing, which I find to be helpful for, you to kind of connect with God on your own, but at the same time that you miss some of that communal element. I know our church we do it monthly, and so it's the first of the month. And on the days that we do communion, we have a taco truck outside. Oh, wow. Which is not really connected to communion, but it happens to fall on Communion Sunday. And so everyone goes out and enjoys lunch together on the patio afterwards, which is really fun. Everyone loves Taco Sunday, so it is connected to communion. So it does in a lot of ways foster some community on weeks that we celebrate, which is cool.
No, that is cool. And as you've thought about other senses, we focused on taste on this podcast, but like as we focus on other senses, like what are other ways, listeners individually or with a small group, because most listeners won't have the ability to change church culture, per se, but like, how do we move this, from an academic to the practical, where it does help us abide with Christ more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it is just, I think that there can be just some thoughtful approaches to how we engage in relationship with each other. I think specifically, the one that's been the most impactful to me is the study of the sense of touch, because touch is so powerful.
Yeah.
And people have such a variety of ways of receiving touch, in some really good and even some negative ways. You have to be because it's so potent. There are some people who are totally touch averse. And so the best way to love them is actually not to touch them. And some people, I think, they actually are more hungry for it. And so to hug them, is something that really ministers to them, to give a hug. But you have to kind of know, you have to be sensitive to know what's going to be the most loving for someone. We know, like on, at a very basic level, we know that like infants will not survive without nurturing touch. And so on some level, everyone needs it. But then we go through life, and for whatever reason, a lot of us are, you have these different, like I have one child who like will always take a back scratch. Like, my kids are grown now, but always will take, if I scratch a back, my son will be like, yeah, he'll like settle in. But then I have one daughter who's like, don't touch me, Mom. Like she doesn't want it unless she really needs it. And so I've just learned like how to connect with each of my kids in a way that communicates love to them. And I think it's a really powerful way. I think it's just something to be thoughtful about. Are there ways that we can communicate love to each other? I think COVID was one of those. This is something I wrote some on. COVID was one of those things that reversed our rules around touch,
Right.
where, like to love someone was to keep your distance for a period
Yeah.
of time. And that was exactly opposite. And then it had really negative effects on people
Mm-hmm.
because you're so isolated. And so to think about like what happens with the rules around touch, depending on the culture and the context, I think it's just important to be mindful of so we can love each other better.
Yeah, no, I love that, the discernment it takes for touch, and for the senses. Like, we don't all receive and experience the senses the same way. And like you said, touch is one of those that can do great harm if not handled properly. And, you reference, the body keeps the score, and that trauma, we carry this trauma, and, a lot of it is associated with our senses. And so to be mindful of that, and then just people with different sensory divergent experiences of life. Like there's just so much wrapped up in our senses that we have to, be aware of to help people. And I appreciate you bringing that into the discussion, just because it can be so easy to think of like, okay, well, I experience it this way, therefore it's the same for everybody. But you point out even that cultural differences between senses and that it's not just this, one size fits all approach. As we begin to wrap up, it's a question I ask all of my guests. And so, what's the story you want the church to tell?
That's a great question. What's the story I want the church to tell? I so want the church to be a place that loves well. And I get sad that we are I think our radical individualism works completely at cross purposes with what the church is meant to do. I think that one of the key insights about what I've learned in this is this idea that dependence is the goal with Christ. Our union with Christ it's like we're not meant to outgrow our need for him. And yet we live in a context where we raise our kids to become autonomous, independent beings who can support themselves, like that's the goal. And, but when you think about it, the sheep and the shepherd, the sheep never outgrow their need for a shepherd. They always need the sheep. And I want more people in the church to see dependence on Christ and each other as actually the way that the church is supposed to operate. And I get sad that, in our own context, like how can we be the church if nobody needs anything from each other? Right. You end up, we become consumers, and that makes me sad because it's so much bigger and more robust than that. And I think that's what we have to offer people who are hungry, like truly spiritually hungry. But, I just worry that we lose our sense of hunger and need, and because we're so, I'm good. I'm good. I don't want to put you out, so I'm fine. I don't need prayers or anything. I'm, like that kind of thing. I want so much more for the church to really embody this, the body of Christ that we're designed to be.
I love that. I love each guest's unique perspective when they answer that question, and this dependence aspect. I love that, and hope you as a listener caught that too, and can meditate and think through, spend time just engaging with that question of where is your dependency factor currently? And I think it's an important question for our culture today. Yeah, because like you said, we want to raise independent creatures. We want to think we're independent, but what I always come back to is you can never eat independently. Like, your food is comes from someplace and somewhere and someone. And I think that's a beautiful illustration of our dependency, of God and his abundance in giving us a super abundant creation full of delight and wonder that he calls us to depend on. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And then some fun questions I always ask too. What's one food you refuse to eat?
Oh, let me think. There's actually probably more than one.
Fair.
I actually I tried for a while to do seafood, and I'm not a seafood person.
Okay.
I don't refuse, but I don't. I tried for a long time, and I just can't. There's something about maybe the texture. Or,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Fair enough.
I wish I liked it more because there's so many dishes that I like. They
Yeah.
sound really good.
For sure.
Yeah.
And you live, near the ocean.
I know. Maybe I should try again.
It's all good. No, I understand. It's yeah. And then on the other side of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
I think any form of bread and cheese.
Okay.
I can get on board with bread, like anything. Bread. I think bread is probably one of my favorites. And then I think there's a chocolate souffle that I've had at a couple different places that would be like my favorite thing to eat.
No. Awesome. Do you have a favorite type of cheese?
No. I like all kinds of cheese. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. No, I understand. Yes.
Yeah.
My wife and I love cheese and meat night, just to
you do. Oh,
charcuterie. Yeah. My first job in the restaurant was as a fromagier, as a cheese guy. And so
What's your favorite cheese?
I like stinky cheeses. Like I like, like the French Epoisse is sort of the king of all cheeses.
Okay.
But it's just a stinky, runny cheese. I think, there's something about it, just that unctuous umami flavor, that the taste belies its stench,
Yeah.
And so, there's some other American cheeses that do well too with that, but French.
That's your
French
favorite.
stinky cheeses are good.
Okay.
Yeah. And then finally, there's a conversation amongst chefs about last meals, as if you knew you had one last meal to enjoy, what would it be? And so, Jeannine, if you had one last meal, what might be on that table?
Listen, Andrew, I hope that I don't disappoint you with this answer because I think you're probably a very fancy food person.
No.
Not very fancy.
It's okay.
I love me a good cheeseburger.
Awesome.
That's like my favorite go-to.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite?
Fancy or not, but yeah.
Do you have a favorite place in Southern California for your cheeseburger?
No, not really. I'm not really. I mean, I like a good cheeseburger anywhere. I mean, I probably should say In-N-Out because that's, like the birthplace of the cheeseburger. It's probably not my favorite, but it's probably one I have a lot. But
for sure.
Yeah.
No, you're not the first person. Richard Beck, who's a professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University. His last meal was a burger and a chocolate malt.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So, you're not alone.
Okay, that's good to know.
You're in great company. I think the world of Richard Beck and, his ideas of hospitality and have really informed me. So, yeah. No, cheeseburger, a good burger, I think is really hard to beat in life. Like, so I'm with you. A cheeseburger. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeannine. This has been really fun. If people want to learn, more about your work, is there a place they can connect? Obviously, your book is available on Amazon or wherever they get their books. But is there another place people can continue to see what you're up to? Or
I'm not super. I don't have like a website or anything like that. But I mean, I'm out on socials, so I have an Instagram and it's public, so people can follow me there. I don't post a lot. I'm not like a super big poster, but I mean, I understand. Biola website usually will have my most up-to-date publications and what. And this book is available wherever.
Yep. So, no, and would strongly encourage you listeners. Get the book. It's a great resource to help you begin to think through what does it mean to really engage the scriptures as a full-bodied person and not just cognitively. So thank you, Jeannine, for your ministry to the church and to the body of Christ. And I really appreciated this conversation and the opportunity to connect.
Thanks, Andrew. It's been really great to talk to you.
Yeah. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.